Hi, everyone. Nice to see such a crowd here. Thank you for your patience. We had some technical difficulties, but hopefully all is okay. Scott is going to wing it. I think he's perfectly capable, right? Yes, perfectly capable. I'm Heather Quinn. I run our School of Design Talk series. I'm going to be super brief with my intro, just because we're running a little bit over. I wanted to let you know about a couple upcoming events. One, which is new. On February 17th, we have Dr. Leslie Noel. She'll be here following the College Art Conference, and so she'll be doing a talk and a workshop for Spotlight on Black Designers for Black History Month. That'll be in tandem with IIT, which is here. And so those details should be on our Facebook page by Monday, I would say. But loosely speaking, the workshop will be here at DePaul at 2:30, and the talk will be at IIT February 17th. That's a Monday at 6 p.m. So put that on your radar as coming soon. We also have game designer Hannah Nicklin coming. That's March 12th, 6 p.m. That's a Thursday night. And then in the spring, as I've already mentioned before, we have Wael Morcos, who will be doing a talk and a workshop, a typographer out of New York City. And then we have Tamiko Teal doing AR and VR. She also will have a talk and a workshop. The AR VR workshop is pretty cool because you don't have to have any experience coding it. She's going to be releasing some codeless apps. So that's very exciting for all the designers who have not worked with AR and VR and are interested in doing so. So I think that is about the summary. Kate Hollenbach has been taking care of Scott while he's here. She's going to do his formal intro, but I just want to say that we've been planning this for well over a year. So it's very exciting to actually have him here now. I'm very excited about that. Okay, take it away, Kate.
Good evening. Thanks for coming to our first design talk of 2020. We're really lucky to have Scott Starrett with us tonight. As many of you who probably read the event flyer for this already know, he is the co-founder and design director of the communication studio Tandem. And in that capacity, Scott acts as a strategic communications advisor to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And he is an outspoken advocate for civic engagement and socially responsible design. And he works with clients and causes large and small, including Reform LA Jails, Movement School, Netflix, Planned Parenthood, and the DNC. And his work has been featured on NPR, the BBC, MSNBC, the Washington Post, Fast Company, Hyperallergic, some places we've heard of before. And so we're really excited to have Scott here and to hear more about his work. So
thank you so much. And thank you, Heather. Thank you, DePaul. Thank you for sticking with me through these technical difficulties. Can everyone hear me all right? Yeah. Excellent. So previously we had it set up so that I could see what slide was coming next, but I'm just going to be as surprised as you are. So stick with me. But again, thank you to both of you. Thank you for the kind introduction. Your school is lovely. Everyone has just been so kind. I did a workshop last night, and it was a lot of fun. And it's beautiful in this space, and your whole campus is beautiful. Do I need that?
You want it?
No, this mic's live. So we're good to go. I'll set it down here. All right. Well, I'm here to talk to you a year after AOC's brand has been active. And I'm going to talk about the emerging importance of technology and design in democracy. Really, I'm going to talk about the persistent importance of technology and design in democracy. And you'll see what I mean as we move forward. Like Kate said, I'm co-founder, design director of Tandem. We are a very small studio based in New York City, as you can see. We took this photo on our roof. We were forged on the principle that the same persuasive techniques used in marketing and advertising can and should be used to advance the greater good. We're a design studio, or a design firm, a design consultancy. Whenever I get in the elevator at my office, people ask what I do, and I say I'm a designer, and they say, an interior designer? And I say, no, I'm a graphic designer, but really we do brand design and brand strategy and visual strategy, identity development, messaging, user experience, product design, content strategy, content development, art direction, design direction, consulting, digital strategy, communications. I tell my mom she can tell her friends we do logos and websites because it's all pretty complicated when you really get down to it, and the word designer or even graphic designer just isn't always suitable for all the different capacities that we operate under and that so many of you operate under. I'm not special in this, right? I think every graphic designer these days crosses disciplines and works with all sorts of technology. You know, more often than not, it's not logos. Design looks a lot like this, which is a fairly uncomplicated set of wireframes with our UI patterns, or UX patterns, pardon. You know, and when we're lucky, we get to do the fun stuff that everybody dreams of, print design and posters, and get engaged and activated with causes, which we're really honored to be a part of more often than not these days. I prefer the term communication design. I think it sums everything up that we do, whether we're consulting, whether we're writing copy for people, or putting together a brand strategy or a content strategy. It's all communication, and it's all communication design, and we're thinking deeply about how these things will go into the world and how they'll be used. And this takes us to why you're here, and why you're probably interested in listening to me talk today. So I'll take you back to 2016. Our studio is located in Union Square in Manhattan, and it was 2016. Everyone was talking about politics in New York. You couldn't go out to lunch without hearing somebody talking about Bernie or Hillary, and there were a lot of, you know, spirited conversations, arguments, etc. And it was interesting, and it was a lot of fun. And one of the people that I tended to have these discussions with, I called Sandy. And you all know her now as AOC. So here you see three of us that were at the studio at the time. We've expanded a little bit. We actually had 4 folks in the studio. Carlos, our other designer, moved on, and he's doing very well. He's a very talented designer. But that's the 3 of us that were kind of the core, and they're going to lunch at Flat's Fix, which was the taco shop that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was a bartender at. If you see her down there in the corner shaking margaritas. It was a weird time, and you know, things didn't play out as we thought they would. And everyone was talking about what civic engagement, what involvement, what activism, action meant, and what we would be doing in a post-Trump era. Alexandria decided that she wanted to go to Flint, Michigan, and Standing Rock, that she wanted to be really active. And our studio said, we'll support you. We lent her our GoPro camera. I don't know that she used it, but perhaps she did in recording videos. She started recording her journey, and she started to express herself on social media. And she started tweeting, posting her videos on Facebook of her journey as she was just an everyday activist without a real goal in mind. But something Sandy did have, and I'll call her Sandy, I can't help it throughout this presentation, but Sandy's AOC. Something that she always did have was just a fantastic presence. And she wasn't doing that to garner a bunch of attention. She was really an advocate for people, and she really cared about the causes that she's still fighting for today. And she was also a natural. She was a natural on social media, and she did really well. And I remember after Trump won, we were all in different mental states, and I was maybe a little more cynical at the time. And I remember reading a Facebook post that she wrote that was so positive and so encouraging and so reflective of what you can do as an individual. And I think that you know, she still upholds that attitude today. She's still she's a very different person because of what she's been through, but at the core, she's still the same person today that we knew back then, talking about politics at the bar, eating tacos, drinking margaritas. So is there a difference between arrogance and insight? If you saw the write-up for this talk, I posed a few questions that I'd get throughout it, and hopefully they all kind of weave together at the end here. But I think the answer is yes. I do think there's a difference between arrogance and insight, and I think that they can also look the same, right? They can also look the same at the time, and it all depends on how things shake out. And perhaps had Alexandria not won, we would have seemed arrogant. But Alexandria got picked up by a group, or they spotted her. They noticed her, a group called Justice Democrats, and they encouraged her to run for office. They were a group of people that had come off the Bernie Sanders campaign, and as she had worked as a field operative for Bernie Sanders, and some of these folks worked in technology for Bernie, in field and fundraising in different capacities. They came together after the fact and decided that they wanted to do something different in politics. They wanted to take a new approach. They have experience in startups and technology, in communications design, and I also had a background. I lived in Austin, Texas, where I worked in political communications for about 4 years. And so I got to talking to these folks who I met through Sandy, and we started working on microsites. We started pumping out content really quick. In politics, you have to move at a fast clip, and you're always in a hurry, and you're always behind schedule. But our studio, and me specifically, spent a lot of weekends working through some stuff, and we eventually made some things for the Justice Democrats. These were some templates that we put out for them, as people began launching their campaigns and fundraising. This was kind of a stopover until they could launch their own presence in the campaign. We got to do some fun icons. I'm always a fan of Americana imagery or anything related to civic engagement. But ultimately, she launched her campaign, and here you see her old identity, the identity that came from Brand New Congress, which was a sister organization to Justice Democrats. And this is kind of the boilerplate logo that all the candidates got in the beginning. And you'll see me with my silly man bun in the top corner there, the top right for you all, kind of hiding, I guess. But this was June 24th, 2017, to put this into perspective a little bit. Let's see what slide comes next. I don't remember. Okay. Do we follow precedent to our own detriment? Let me get back, actually, for a second, because the idea of that arrogance versus insight, I think that we started to look at politics a little bit like a startup. We started to look at it a little less like the politics of old, and we brought our skill sets, and we brought what we were good at, and we brought what we knew in our experiences to the arena. This is a small caveat, but worth it. So, do we follow precedent to our own detriment? Business learned the methods of appealing to the public from politics, but it continually improved those methods, while politics clung to the old formulas. This is a quote from Bernays, who's most famous for writing a book called Propaganda. Now, Bernays has kind of a checkered past, but I think the book is prescient. I think the book is worth reading, and shines light on this idea of propaganda, which is something that I'll try to talk about throughout this talk. But, here you see that idea of precedent and following precedent, and that idea of whether or not we're following precedent to be safe, because just that's the way things are done, an appeal to tradition, one of my favorite logical fallacies. But, for the longest time, politics really looked the same. It looked a lot like this, really high chroma reds, high chroma blues. Show them you're a true American with as many stars and stripes and wavy flags as you can fit in. And Congressman Joe Crowley, who I believe is probably a great guy, he'd been uncontested, I believe, for 15 years in his district and a congressman for 20. And he's in New York's 14th district. This is who Alexandria eventually ran against. He had $3.5 million in the bank. He was the fourth most powerful Democrat in Congress, and a lot of people thought he might take over for Speaker Pelosi when the time came. He did politics the old way, and he had a huge war chest, and he sent out these flyers and told people that he was going to stop Trump. You know, he didn't do anything wrong, but he also didn't adapt to the times. So what's the value in breaking the rules? Which I may not have an answer for, but we'll try. Jimmy Carter broke the rules. He had a green visual identity, which was very appropriate for Jimmy. You know, he's the one that put the solar panels on the White House right before Ronald Reagan tore them off. And, you know, this approach worked for Jimmy once. And then Jesse Jackson also kind of broke the rules. I really love this poster. It's bold. It didn't work for Jesse, but it's really interesting. This highly posturized, really, you know, cutting to the quick. It gets your attention, and it's super easy to read. Jesse also had an identity that played out with the normal red, white, and blue stars and stripes, but this was an interesting addition to his identity. And then you all, I'm sure, are familiar with Shepard Fairey's Hope poster, and in there you see Soul Senders, Obama O. And this really changed politics as we knew it in its relationship to design. You know, I think you can hear, if you listen closely, the faint cries of propaganda from, you know, folks on the right. But, you know, I guess my question is, what political communications aren't propaganda? You know, when are you, I mean, there's nefarious, you know, you can think about propaganda that way, but that's back to Bernays in that book, Propaganda. You know, if you're trying to do something to intentionally shift somebody over to your side, that's propaganda. It often gets a pejorative connotation, but you know, I think we should think about the broadening of definitions, just like the definition of design. So Obama, I think, made a great choice in going for this O. You know, I know David Axelrod was a big part of bringing the design community in, bringing Soul Sender into Obama's campaign. And I'm not sure if they were prescient, if they had the foresight to know that a logo would really take off, a simplified logo like this, or if people just really liked it and so they continued to run with it. You know, Hillary and Michael Beirut at Pentagram did a similar thing, and I think it's smart. And I think that when you have enough money and you have enough time to really get that out in front of people, they have time to learn through repetition that this represents Obama and this represents Hillary. But obviously, if you didn't have supporting information, if you didn't have context, you can't just brand a candidate with a mark that doesn't have any accompanying language and communications. You know, at the same time, this is all not without precedent. You know, this has happened here and there before. But I think Obama's really the first time they embraced that idea of a logo mark and variable identities in the way that they did. What could be? When you are organizing people, the first thing you do is talk about the history of what other people have been able to accomplish. People that look like them, workers like them, ordinary people. That's a quote from Dolores Huerta, who was one of the foundational members of the Farm Workers Union that put on the strike in California. Don't buy grapes. Up here you see a sign that says strike in Spanish. And this was the first place we went when we thought about Alexandria and we thought about what she was trying to do and we thought about the connection she was trying to make with people, with workers just like her. And not only because this was a successful movement, because this was a movement with a lot of heart. There was no spite in the Farm Workers Union movement, and they also had this branding or these communications that really speak to necessity. You know, when you look at this sign, you can see the peeled edges. You can see that this has been cut out and applied to this placard board. And there's just something so beautiful and something so immediate about that when you can communicate that your cause needs to happen right now. You know, this would not look the same had she taken the time to cut out serif typeface. You know, that says something different. The fact that it's this chunky, quick message says a lot. These are the references that we look to in addition to the Farm Workers Union, or some of them included, obviously. And you know, along with embodying the populism of the Farm Workers Union, we also recognize that Shepard Fairey was onto something. You know, he, I think, brushes up against commercialism in his work in a certain aspect, and there was something there that's worth thinking about. You know, when you make something really accessible to more people, it's a hard thing to define, and it's a hard thing to recognize when you cross the line towards something inauthentic. But it was certainly something that was on our mind. Evita, also something on our radar. And this Hillary Clinton poster, which is a mystery, if any of you know the origins of the designers that put this together, this is a banner that went up in Texas. There were a couple of them. And I've talked to some reporters in Texas that are also interested to find out. We've all been kind of looking around. And there's something very interesting and alive in that photo. I can see why the campaign didn't embrace it entirely, but I still am left to wonder, what if they had? You know, maybe there's something human in it, even though it maybe feels a bit propagandistic to people. And I think that's a line that I'm certainly interested in exploring. We also wanted to look to action. We wanted to look towards something that is, you know, politics simulates war more often than not, and this will come up again as well. Even the term campaign, right, comes from war, but you don't want to use violence. You don't want to embody, especially in a populist approach to people where you're trying to speak to everybody. You don't want to use violent terms. So we look to luchadores, wrestlers, and the idea of action and movement. And you start to see where we were possibly looking at some of these lines, and the idea of a boxing poster, for example, was really interesting to us at the time, along with the Westinghouse, what you all probably know as the Rosie the Riveter poster, We Can Do It. But here you see, again, a lot of Farm Workers Union imagery for us was initially captivating. Union seals, badges, logos were also something we were looking to. How do they communicate this idea of collective movements? And it's something that we explored that didn't necessarily find its way in a literal sense into our final branding, but still something that we are captivated with today and still consider. And something that we, I'll show you in a couple slides here, did initially try to adapt. There's also this idea of, you know, this idea of Sol Invictus, this idea of, you know, a little bit of, you know, deification, if I dare say, and that idea that people are really looking for someone that they can look up to and be inspired by, and that idea of making someone more than themselves and making someone represent a movement was something that we were thinking very deeply about when we did this branding. All told, we had a very short period of time. It was the right design at the right time. This is actually a Soul Sender quote about the Obama logo. It's not for us, but we're here in Chicago. I think it's only appropriate to pay our respects to Soul. And I think it's also the case for us in this branding exercise. So we had done that work with Justice Democrats and Brand New Congress, and you know, we'd been helping the cause, and we kind of showed them we were good for it. And eventually they came to us and said, it's time to do the identity. And we had 2 weeks to do it from start to finish. So I found out when Sandy was behind the bar and I was eating lunch that evening. I eat lunch way too late. And I immediately started sketching, where I did this terrible drawing of her down here, very rushed, you know, but that's my like napkin, sketched it on a napkin moment here. And then we went out from there, and you know, we noticed this something interesting about this populism and this mark, where we're kind of brushing up against that idea of the Obama mark, the Obama logo with maybe a little more information with her name perhaps. And her name was so long and she wanted to keep it that we're exploring this idea of condensed type. You know, we have to fit her name all over the place. How are we going to do it? That was one of our main concerns. You know, Elizabeth Warren has a wonderful Senate. I mean, I think her presidential branding's great too, but her Senate ID had her signature in it, and I'd always admired it quite a bit. So we asked Alexandra to sign her name, and it's not quite right. Like this thing at the end, we didn't know what to do with that, but that didn't work. So you know, we went in towards that line of slightly commercial, that line of you know, making something kind of similar to the Hope poster. You know, if I'm being honest, that was our first approach, and we all were very attracted to this Cesar Chavez stamp, but specifically Maria Arenas, our senior designer, that played a huge role in this branding exercise. She definitely found this stamp to be one of the most inspiring pieces of reference for us along the way. Here you see some of Maria's sketches as we got going, and her cat that has since passed. R.I.P. I know. That got that's the biggest response I've gotten from you all this evening. I'll tell Maria. So here you see those union badges coming into play a little bit, where we were trying to fit them in. And like I said, we had a really short period of time. We didn't have a lot of consultation. So we had to rely on all of the time we'd spent talking to Sandy, you know, what we knew about her as a person, and what we knew about her political views and her plans to run this campaign. So what we did is present her with a dual identity strategy. We showed her this identity first, which actually did have the inverted exclamation marks at some point, but not on this slide apparently. That was something that we weren't quite sure whether she was going to be interested in including, whether that was possibly over the top. But we showed her this identity first, and at the end she was like, I love it, it's a lot of fun, and then we had already prepared this a little more formal serif identity. And the idea was to use this star to connect the two and have a really widespread variable identity if needs be. If there was going to be a really fancy fundraiser, she could put on her fancy clothes, you know, but then when she was out in the neighborhoods with the people, there's this much more populist approach. And she was all in on that. The thing is, branding work, and we started to produce collateral, and we just kind of never looked back. Once the volunteers started interacting with this brand, especially the yellow, they preferred a lot. We included yellow in this deck to show her. Well, it actually came from the posters, but we included it in the identity in addition to purple. Purple being the combination of red and blue. And something that Sandy still to this day very much wants us to continue working with. And then yellow, because I really do see yellow as sort of the fourth and the unspoken member of the Americana color palette in America's brand identity, right? If you think about the seal, and you think about the eagle's talons and the eagle's beak and the accoutrement on the seal, it's all yellow or gold, you know, and it plays in. It also is, you know, not something that we went to great lengths to articulate at the time, but a reference to that Westinghouse poster. And, you know, the campaign was weary of yellow at first, and once we shipped, we asked them if we could print 3 color poster variations, and once we shipped it to them, the volunteers were really excited about this yellow version. And so it kind of, you know, became what caught people's attention, and we noticed that we might actually be onto something when people started stealing these in the neighborhood. They started disappearing, and the volunteers were having a problem of them going, you know, being taken down from light posts and bodega windows. And, you know, that's great, and then also kind of problematic. But we went on to brand the rest of the campaign and to put the design work that we'd put in for the Justice Democrats and Brand New Congress into her website and the rest of her materials. And, you know, while we made some choices that made things harder for us, shearing the type, which is that was a choice that Maria made, was to shear that type at 15 degrees, which I think really brought the identity to life. Really has a lot to do with making that connection to the luchadors, to boxing posters, to this action. And, you know, you tend to see this in branding. The ACLU now currently has, I forgot to include them in this, but, you know, people are, yeah, it works for, I think, a number of reasons. But yeah, we got to do a lot of collateral. We continue to get to work with her. We got to do some fun icons. We did some brand extensions to see if we could kind of, you know, expand what it would work for. And then it lived in the world, you know, pretty comfortably, which always feels great when you can see people really excited to adorn the apparel. You know, now's a good time to say that had Alexandria not been a star from the beginning, had she not been fantastic at what she does, has she not been articulating what people have been desiring from a leader, you know, for decades, perhaps, the whole thing would have fallen flat. You know, we could have presented her as this populist hero only to have her fail in the debates against Crowley. But that's not the story, and that's not what happened. And so I point that out, though, because, you know, for the designers out there in the crowd, it can be tough. You never know when you get a break. You may never get a break. And we were perfectly comfortable with the idea that we'd be toiling away in obscurity, but doing things for the right reasons. In this case, it has paid off in a number of senses, but you just never know. I would say that that's a huge victory, but it's a zero-sum game, and no one would have remembered us in history. We might have gotten a few congratulations from some design folks out there, but I don't think that this would have captivated America's imagination, our identity, the way that it did, if Alexandria weren't such a captivating, electric leader, you know? So it's always hand in hand, and all we can do as designers is attempt to brand to the most authentic core of the job that we're working on. So it was a lot of fun to go hand things out, though, I will say, and have people actually really want to take literature from you. This was a pride parade, and everyone was just so excited they'd ask you to come over and hand them a palm card, which is unheard of. I've spent a lot of time in politics. I've never had someone ask, or in New York. Like, no one's ever like, give me a flyer, like, accost me on the street. We call those people attactivists. They wear these vests with their clipboards. So she made it, you know. It's hard to reflect sometimes. Our world feels like it's speeding up, but, you know, she's the youngest woman ever elected to Congress, and she's a friend of mine that I met at a bar. You know, it's just so crazy. Sometimes I just get struck with a moment of reality. And, you know, she's doing it. She's making waves every single day. And I would love to show you guys all of the branding work that we're working on for her for 2020. I'll show you some of the extensions of that brand, but we're going to keep under wraps the website and the slightly modified new brand that will be coming out here shortly, hopefully. So Emancipatory Media encourages interaction and feedback, contributes to the political learning process, and is collectively produced. So I really think that what was successful about Alexandria's campaign is that it was a true grassroots DIY effort. And we just invited anybody we could into the campaign that was willing to share their skills. And it worked out. And I think because she's such a strong leader, she was able to attract people that really believed in her. And so we got some really talented folks along with her. But I think we're also in a new era where people want to and willingly participate. I think that happens for a number of reasons. I think people are more activated than they have been in the past. And at the same time, I think the barriers of entry to technology have been lowered, and technology's been democratized. So more people take a stab at it. You know, more people make a meme. More people paint their own painting because they have software that helps them get there. More people, you know, make a pretty picture, a pretty painting on an iPad Pro, and so forth. And I think that we're in kind of a new era of politics when you look at this idea of emancipatory media, when you look at this idea of involvement. And rather than run from it, and rather than try to close off our systems, which as designers we're so used to locking down logos and having media kits that we're complaining that people are always using the wrong typeface or using the wrong shade of color, you know, we still want to control that to some degree, but at the same time, you know, communication's communication. If someone's out there spreading your message alongside you, that means that they're passionate about the message. So rather than stop them or create gates or walls, if you will, let's open things up, I think, is the new way. And let's design things that are foolproof, you know? Let's not design precious systems if we know that they're going to be used out there in the world. Let's design these really sturdy things that people can see and get immediately. You know, we really wanted the identity to look like it had been cut out of construction paper. And I kind of glossed over the typeface choice, which we made because it worked, because it was a beautiful typeface. And then as we were shipping this identity out, we kind of had that uh-oh moment. We've been moving so quickly, you know, we better take a peek to see what this typeface, you know, it was a free typeface, but we double-checked the license. We were cool. All we had to do was, it was requested that we donate to the International Justice Movement, an anti-slavery campaign. Wonderful. We did that. We donated some money. And then we actually ended up getting a note from Jamie Wilson, the fantastic type designer and fantastic designer in general that made Nor'Wester, that typeface. And it was all kind of meant to be, it felt. I don't always tend towards fate, but it was pretty wonderful. And we still have a relationship with Jamie today. We still work with him on developing new typefaces. So, you know, here we are. This is maybe the bottom of the barrel when it comes to emancipatory media. This is, if you ever want to go down this rabbit hole on Amazon, you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of terrible knockoffs. That's fun. And then there are, you know, other folks out there that liked our work as well, I think. And they, yeah. Even some of our language slips into some of their efforts. But, you know, this idea of emancipatory media, it's not something we invented, certainly, but it is something that's catching on and that you can see a lot more of. This is for the Pete Buttigieg campaign, a group named HyperAct, which maybe some of you have heard of them. They're a fantastic design group. Have created this very thoughtful and very interesting, interactive identity design tool. Now, yeah, it's fantastic. It's great. I think, you know, I think it speaks to Mayor Pete's tone. I think it speaks to who he is and how he's represented himself wonderfully. And I love this idea of trying to bring people in and trying to bring artists in with these customized, you know, hand-done type. I think that's fantastic. Hand lettering in politics, we've all been waiting for it. It's fantastic. Okay, so if you saw in my breakdown one of the little things I laid in there, how am I doing on time?
You're so good, I'm not even paying attention. It's 6:48.
Okay, we're doing good. We're doing good. I'll probably be at about 50 minutes, and then we'll leave some time for Q&A. So in that design description, I put in there that how's the post office related to Twitter? So let's find out. Birds, duh. No. So if you go back to Benjamin Franklin and this beautiful woodcut, which unfortunately, like so many other wonderful things, has been appropriated by racists and bigots. Don't let it. Take it back. Just like Americana, just like the American flag, I think it's important that all of us stand up for our country and don't let America's brand be taken over by bigots and bullies. But this is a beautiful woodcut. It also, you know, just like Edward Bernays and anyone else, if you look back in history at George Washington's teeth or anything else, you'll see that there's an ugly history in it. And this is very relative to the 7 Years' War and, you know, a battle against Native Americans and the French. But we'll look past that and look at it as really the first political cartoon to make waves. Also beautifully done. It's a beautiful piece, beautiful woodcut. It still holds up. And Benjamin Franklin is known for so many things, but you may or may not know that he was Postmaster General at a certain point. He really cleaned up the Postal Service, which was a mess under the British. They did not have solid postal routes. And Benjamin Franklin came along, made solid postal routes, then got kicked out by the British and went and fought against them and went on to be a ambassador to France on behalf of America. But, you know, it's idea of following precedent, this idea of doing things as they've always been done. You know, this line formation that the British are so famous in the Revolutionary War for maintaining this strategy of fighting. Now, a lot of people think that, or it becomes, you know, common parlance, maybe a misnomer, that, you know, that line formation versus the American Minutemen that were hiding in the bushes is really why America won the war. Now, that's not quite right, but it's an interesting metaphor. It's interesting to think about, and it kind of does play into the story in the end. So here we have an etching that Paul Revere did that's not too dissimilar from the Join or Die political cartoon. This obviously isn't a cartoon, and Paul Revere's maybe not the best etcher, but it's interesting that it got printed and it made waves in a similar way. And this is really, a lot of historians point to a big signifier in you know, America's separation from Great Britain. And this really stirred up a lot of emotions. And if anything is propaganda, this is propaganda, right? And so the British were maintaining this line formation, but when you look at what was really happening, and I'm not a historian, and I'm sure this is being live streamed, and there's people, you know, maybe turning it off as I get into this history this deep, but, you know, the British had advantages that we didn't have. They, sure, they had some disadvantages. We knew the terrain. You know, they had better weapons, though. They had better supplies. They had support from a kingdom. Their soldiers were better trained, you know. There are a number of reasons that they probably should have won that war. But what I think is interesting is a couple things. It's this idea of precedent and this idea of sentiment, right? What the British didn't have was the favor of the people. And it's pieces like this that were really the disruptor. And then it's also this idea of these postal routes. George Washington created the USPOD, the U.S. Postal Department, and eventually, I believe, sent this letter along those postal routes. And this letter called for a break in norms or a break in precedent, a break in decorum, because it was not thought back in the day that it was very gentlemanly to spy. But in this letter that Washington sent along his postal routes, he broke that precedent and asked a gentleman to set up a spy ring. That didn't go well, and they fired him. But then they started a new one called the Culper Spy Ring, which you may or may not know about. And that Culper Spy Ring, sorry, I was supposed to do that earlier. That's the first postal seal. That's Mercury, and then this is an engraving that was the postal logo for a long time. But that spy ring really went on to help America consolidate, along with those routes, along with those postal routes, where people were able to spread messages and think around this enemy that was this big, bad, well-equipped, well-funded machine. This was a grassroots effort, essentially, of people coming together and finding it within themselves and stealing their nerves and fighting against a bigger power. That's just a joke. I don't even know why. I don't even know why. But, you know, this idea of precedent, posters aren't for everywhere, right? What we did in New York's 14th, which is one of the most diverse and one of the most densely packed districts, you know, the average congressional district in America has a little over 710,000 people. And New York's 14th has all those people in a small space, right? So when we put a poster out in the Bronx and in Queens, a lot of people are going to see it, right? A lot of people are going to walk by it. And we got to use this, you know, this interesting language, this visual language that was a little more dynamic. You know, when we first made that Ocasio poster, we stepped back from it and we were like, does this look a little too much like a Netflix special? You know, like a poster we might see in the subway, right? And maybe it does, you know, and maybe that's part of what's effective about it, is that it kind of blurs this line between this, our understanding and our relationship with the commercial world and this idea of who a person could be. But this is Montana, and, you know, that's an at-large district with over 1 million people. In one state, there's one district. Posters aren't going to work there, right? And so we're trying to think now about how we move forward and how we begin to bring the whole country into issues that matter to the whole country, how we break that precedent, which that precedent's been broken in other ways, you know, which is really how we get back to how's Twitter like the post office, right? Twitter is a break in precedent for my friend Sandy, right? She harnessed the power of social media to bring people together, but we've also seen a break in precedent. That was a Freudian slip. As our president just broke his own record the other day, if you haven't heard, he's being impeached. I don't know if you guys knew that, but you know, he is also connecting with people. He is also sidestepping these previous norms among so many other norms. But this idea, this naivety that we could stand in a line formation and not take seriously the postal routes and the value in that technology, which really that was the height of quick-fire communication at the time, if you think about it, right? And so if we're not looking ahead to see these things that are breaking down what we know and what we see as normal, if we're not thinking ahead as time does begin to move faster and communication does begin to move faster, we'll get lost. At the same time, I love to go backwards, and I love to think about what we have been and what was normal and what should be normal moving forward. The designers, again, in the room might be familiar, or other people, but from a design perspective, these posters, the National Parks posters, WP era, actually from the Federal One Arts project around the time of the WPA, represent, to me, something from a time lost. You know, why can't we celebrate things that we should all love with good art? Why can't we show people the beauty in a thing or inspire people to do something more with art? And I think that that has something to do with people's fear of that idea of propaganda. It's not propaganda if it's all stars and stripes and high chroma red and blue for some reason, because we're used to that. But it's propaganda if you feel something. I don't know. I think we all need to check in with ourselves and think about it. We don't mind Nike and Apple selling us propaganda, but for some reason we want our politicians to stay where? I don't know. But this next project is pretty special to me because I saw a chance to pay homage to these beautiful posters that were done by a gentleman by the name of C. Don Powell. And he went on to oversee, he was the chief designer of the Parks Posters Project. There were originally 14 Parks posters. I believe there are only 12 now that you can see that are in high enough repair. They live at the Library of Congress, among some other places. There's a guy, I think his name is Ranger Dave, if I have that right, and he restores these things. He does really great facsimiles of them, and they're just beautiful pieces of artwork. And here you see C. Don Powell hand painting the Yosemite poster, which is brilliant, but also a little crazy. They were hand painting these PSAs. They were painting these signs and then sending them out. And this gentleman, Tony Valonis, I should mention that I was born in Kansas. And this doesn't mean anything, but Chester Don Powell was born in Westmoreland, Kansas, and that was just a nice thing that I discovered along the way. And so Tony Valonis, this man here, he worked for LaGuardia in New York, and he was helping them with their PSAs, with their government communications. He had grown up working in a sign shop, silk screening 50 cents off at signs for Macy's. At the time, the process was called silk screening. He eventually went on to name it serigraphy when applied to art. He thought he needed a bit more erudite a name, which we all appreciate. But Tony Valonis, as it turns out, grew up learning those techniques in a shop, his cousin's shop in Astoria, which is in the New York's 14th district, which also just tickles me. I don't know. Matters or not. But snap back to today and back to Twitter, where one day I went to a diner to meet with Sandy to talk about the 2020 campaign. And I sat down and she said, "I just tweeted out your posters." And I said, "You did? Oh, great." I didn't. We didn't know. We didn't know we didn't know it was coming. But we were prepared in the end. We didn't know it was coming that day. But these posters, sorry, I just went somewhere else in my head. These posters are interlaced, with all these ideas, all this history, all this intention. And so when it comes to the Twitter trolls, right, we are understanding that this is going to be what happens in this day and age. We're making these artifacts and we're eventually going to screen print them. That's my favorite one. Someone was like, "This looks exactly like Chinese propaganda." Which, I get the Soviet propaganda a little more, but what's interesting is I also don't get the Soviet propaganda because it's a direct. Oh yeah, that one's weird. Don't. Sorry. So we design these things with the intention of them being in public discourse, right? We design them with the idea that people would look at them and say, "Propaganda. This is Soviet propaganda," which is interesting because they're American propaganda for the national parks, right? And we're clearly paying homage to this thing, yet everyone's already ready with their arguments. There was, even a pretty well-respected journalist that jumped in and said, "Oh, this looks just like the statue in Stalingrad." This one here, the Pelham Bay poster, which this was built in 1932. This statue honors World War I veterans, right? And so it's interesting, it's all kind of collapsing on itself, and whatever you need in a moment to throw some shade, you take. So that idea of being prepared for the new post office, the new postal routes, understanding how these things will travel, the veins that they'll go through, and what people's responses will be, that's a big part of communication these days, and something that we find very interesting, and ultimately that we can use to our advantage, because if we know that Fox News and Breitbart, we got on Breitbart, y'all, if Breitbart's going to lose their shit about you doing some propaganda posters that pay homage to the parks, the national parks, you can be prepared for that. So finally, in that list of topics that I'd cover is, can design save the world? Which is a conversation that designers always have. Yeah, good design can save the world. No, design won't save the world. And then we'll be cheeky about it. This one's good, if anyone's ever seen it. Design won't save the world. Go volunteer at a soup kitchen, you pretentious. Well, you could fill it in if you can see it. And then, just after rock and roll does. And then the argument continues. Soup won't save the world, which is funny and cheeky. But back to the original idea of me being in the elevator and saying, I'm a designer, and like, oh, you're an interior designer, and then no, and then having to try to contextualize that. I think we also need to get into the semantics of this idea of can design save the world, because this is a conversation that's been happening in design, a little tongue-in-cheek most of the time for a long time, but really at the core of it is, what's the value of design? And I think the reason this conversation's happening is because there's a little bit of magic in design, right? We know the value of engineering. We know what it means to build a bridge over a river. We can all see that with our eyes. Even if you make a table, you know what I mean? We can kind of be like, yeah, that's a nicer table than that, but somebody carved something out of a hunk of wood, right? We understand that. But if we get into the semantics of design, we so often use design, the word, as a metonymy. The idea of like, the pen is mightier than the sword, the pen being language and the sword being war, right? Design is a metonymy. What did Adam Schiff say today? That Donald Trump's language was designed to intimidate, and none of us flinches at that at all. Design is not just a schematic drawing or a plan. A design is the way that we craft a strategy. It's this word that's so amorphous that we apply it to everything. And then let's also take a look at the word world, right? Because, for those folks that either don't believe in science or just don't think it's that big of a deal that carbon emissions are out of control and the world is heating up, if they don't worry about that because the Earth's not going anywhere, it's true. The Earth's not going anywhere. We're not talking about saving the Earth or the planet. Like a lot of species on the planet, right? Us included, which, we're selfish creatures. I think that's important to us. The world and design saving the world is really about our world, right? It is not about the globe. It is about our world, our way of life. And so to the question, can design save the world? It has to. What is a world without design? Why wouldn't we think about how we do things? And so, it's still funny, and we'll still have these conversations. Can design save the world? But I hope if you take anything away from this talk, it's to think a little bit more deeply about how and why we communicate, and maybe be inspired to think that, design can change things. If you think really deeply and you have really great ideas, there is value in that, even though there's a little bit of magic in it. And so with that, I will open it to Q&A. Thank you all so much.
In the beginning of your presentation, you showed a wireframe about all the things that your firm engages in, and some of it was digital, I believe, when consulting. Can you talk a little bit about how your print media ties into driving traffic into digital, and how are you tracking that?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a big question. So we're not tracking it well enough. I'll start there. And tracking it for whom? And in politics, I feel like we're always 5 steps behind. And so this case that I'm making here, like, what if we all stop and think for 5 minutes? Can we get 2 hours of value out of that? That's a tough case to make, and especially when people feel a deadline coming, right? So I'm always this guy that's like, whoa, let's just have the call. What if we do a 10-minute call? And they're like, no, there's no time for that. And so then we make decisions, and then they're like, you made the wrong decisions, and then we're looking at 16 hours of work. Okay, so to your question, we're we're never tracing it enough. We're never tracking it enough. But if you look at that Green New Deal concept, that's a pretty good example of how we think about print and how we think about really its footprint is so very small. You know, people in the Bronx, we make posters for them, and we made those posters for them originally, but there's so much more material that we put out, you know, with the intention of making print. Sure, these posters are going to be serigraphs, you know, and they're going to go into some museums here and there, and there will be prints, and people will see them someday. But, you know, Sandy has like 5 million followers, you know, on her social accounts. So the number of people that'll see these in their digital format dwarfs the number of people that'll ever see them in real life. And so we think about that constantly. At the same time, we're not ready to give up on this idea of the poster. We don't want everything to be horizontal just because it feeds into your feed so much better. You know, we're trying to hang on to this idea that it's okay for things to be real, and I think people are attaching to that. And so a lot of the value that we could quantify gets lost, but I think we see a lot of qualified value, and in our firm, qualifying value is a big part of the case we're making to people. You know, and we think we can make a pretty good case for it.
Where do you find the line between taking inspiration and just straight up stealing someone else's design? Because you mentioned something, like you showed part of your work, or part of someone else's work that completely resembles your own.
Yeah, and I think I'm like giving them a hard time for cribbing our work, right? And I think that like qualitative versus quantitative value, it's a fine line, and often it can be determined by the people involved. Now, we're pretty strict about it, and I think that you know, a lot of people saw the Ocasio work and said, I recognize that. They immediately had that feeling. But when you really add up all the influences upon it, we didn't directly rip off anything. We found our own reasons to do things. And so a ton of people are out there cribbing all sorts of people, and some people make a great living at stealing from other people. It's not of interest to us, though, because we really are trying to create, you know, valuable, authentic work that represents the people that we have conversations with. You know, that's one of the things that our firm kind of demands of our clients is we have to meet you. We don't do this long distance relationship where we just pump out logos, because that's when you're under pressure and you start stealing things that'll work. You know, we establish a relationship, we build trust, and then we explain the references that we're making, and we're actually selling stories and narratives. We're selling that idea that you can look at a mark or you can look at some materials and there are layers of information in there, and you can't really steal that from anyone. You know, as much you know, you could steal someone's identity. It's very similar.
You mentioned that you're doing some like brand rebranding for her. How are you balancing her recognizability right now? Everybody sees that and knows what it is, with pushing it forward in a new direction maybe in the future.
Well, that's yeah, it's a very, very poignant question. That's the struggle, you know, and I think anyone that works in branding or anyone that has worked in branding, if people recognize your mark, that is much more than half the battle, you know. And I don't mean to throw shade, but Bed Bath & Beyond, I think, has the worst logo of anyone. And I'm sorry if any of you know that designer, if that designer ever hears this, but like, that is the laziest, like, well, we could just make the word go beyond, you know, like, we'll make it bigger as it goes. You know, it's like, I really have a low opinion of that mark. But we all recognize it, and there's so much value in that, you know, and when do you decide to change that? When do you decide that you can get away with that? And if you go and look at all of the rebrands that are happening now and the people that get pushback, or you talk to Michael Beirut of Pentagram, which he never comments on other designers' work the way that I just did, which I don't feel great about, but it's a good example, you know. You know, I think we are trying to maintain that recognizability. There's a lot of value in that, and it's recognized far and wide. So, you know, our main goal as designers is to protect that on some level. so that we don't completely reinvent the wheel, because that'll also throw people off. And it's not about the value. It's not about any monetary value, but like if you've got people's attention, you know, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to get people's attention. So we've got people's attention. And then I think we're trying to put forth extensions. We're trying to put forth these other ways that you can communicate new messages, you know, a sense of maturity, a sense of development, or you know, a change in directions towards new issues for your platform, for example. But we're trying to not bake all that in or feel forced to into the mark and the identity itself. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was curious about your Green New Deal parks posters, where you got the inspiration to put monorails in each of those. Because like, the only place I can think of monorails is like Seattle World's Fair of 1962.
Yeah.
And like Disneyland, Disney World.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, World's Fair posters and World's Fairs were a huge influence to that, because PSAs in general and World's Fair posters are kind of go hand in hand. And so that Pelham Bay Park poster definitely inspired by a Chicago World's Fair poster, in fact. So here's the honest truth of it is, who wants to see an empty rail in a painting? Right? Like, how literal are we supposed to get? It is an idyllic vision, right? And so I understand that. And I was honestly surprised that more people didn't make fun of the monorail along the way. But from a design choice, it'd be boring. You know what I mean? So we're not trying to literally paint the future. You know what I mean? We are trying to paint an idea of, you could travel faster from place to place. Isn't that awesome? And the engineers among us and the more semantic among us will be like, monorail, you know? But it does, you know, yes, I think there will be 2 tracks in the future. One going and coming back, yeah. I think you're right.
Yeah, given, I think, how you were talking about like looking towards the future for design, with the current political atmosphere heading the way it is and the way that you've advanced design, or how design is advancing, do you see any changes the field could experience down the line, like 2020 election post, or hope I'm making that clear?
I think I understand, but let's clarify. So you're wondering if I see any big technological changes on the horizon?
Or just like design based, changes? Like just how the mentality when you were discussing like propaganda, what makes it, what doesn't make it. Do you see that shifting over a long period of time, or do you think like what you're doing now could start like an avalanche of change that slowly progresses? Like we're even talking about how some candidates are already kind of modernizing their designs for their logos instead of like the last few elections where it's been very strictly red, white, blue.
I think that we can take credit for contributing to more interest in design and politics. We certainly did not, I think we cannot take credit for revolutionizing the field as a whole. I think that we did a thing that really caught people's attention, but you know, we also did it for someone that made history. So our influence, I think, I want to be modest about any kind of projection of our own influence. You know, Hillary Clinton's campaign thought, and I had a great conversation last night with some folks about this. They thought very long and hard about design and had brilliant design and effective design from a technical standpoint. You know, I think what's missing in there is that people wanted more human being in that campaign. Designers can't necessarily do that. Consultants can suggest, I mean, I'm always getting out of my lane and telling people things I shouldn't in my job, but you know, I couldn't have convinced Hillary Clinton to open up about her childhood or something. And I mean, I've seen her speak in private, you know, without cameras, and she's brilliant. You know what I mean? I think she suffered from all of humanity, like judging her in you know, and continuing to judge her in perpetuity, and she felt that, and it affected her relationship to design, which is a relationship to openness. You know, and again, here the line blurs. You know, people love Sandy in part because she'll whip her phone out after a meeting and tell people about it. You know, and there's my design, our design has nothing to do with that, right? So Elizabeth Warren's design, they're doing great. You know, some other folks have trouble, I think, modernizing and accepting that you do need a little more of this accessibility, or you do need to break a little bit of precedent, or be more agile. And so, you know, if anything, if we can contribute anything, or we talk to some presidential candidates, you know, I think that we'll talk about that strategy. But I think there are a lot of smart people out there thinking about that, and it will. I think you know, but then there are all, like, there's also the MAGA hat. You know, it's like, that wasn't brilliant. Like, I'm just, you know, people wanted a totem. They wanted a token. It didn't matter what it was. You know, it could have been like the poop emoji that said Trump on it. And I feel like people would be wearing sweaters with that. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, sorry to be so hyperbolic, but, you know, so time and place and context, I think, will have a lot of influence. I do think, though, in smaller races and DIY and grassroots movements, people are starting to focus more on, oh, I could get people's attention. I don't just have to do a serif, you know, type with my name. Like, I can actually let somebody express who I am. And you've got people that are doing their identities in pink and, you know, bright orange and all sorts of stuff that they feel like represents them. And I think that's what we've contributed more to, probably, is that kind of grassroots mentality, because she ran such a grassroots campaign. Yeah, it's a good question. Anybody else? We can also go to. Yes.
I have something I've been agonizing over whether to say or not. Given that someone's name is their brand also, and having worked with the guy at VSA Partners, I feel I should point out that his name is Saul Cinder, not Soul Cinder.
Did I say it wrong?
You said Soul Cinder.
Oh, okay.
Fingernails on the blackboard.
I'm sorry.
But he calls himself Saul, just so everybody know. And I wouldn't say it except we're in a room full of students who might go forth and mispronounce it.
And we're in Chicago.
And that's where he is. Yeah. So you got to be really careful.
What's that? We're so polite. Yes. Well, I'm from the Midwest. I understand this language. And I apologize to you and Saul.
Just think of Solomon.
I appreciate your mnemonic device. I do. And I probably heard that correctly and then did it wrong. So I will think of Solomon from here on out. No, you're good. We both are. It's a very human moment. It's great. Okay. Any other last questions?
Quick one.
Okay.
Just on that, that's a nice segue to kind of name identity. You really pumped Ocasio as kind of the hero of the word bubble.
Yeah.
Mark. Was there any like overthinking or debate on that, and then thinking about like how this would be received, and like how we know her?
Yeah, I mean, and it's kind of surprising because now we know her as AOC, which was a very natural thing. We pushed for Ocasio originally just based on, I worked for a guy in Texas that put his name on the ballot as Hugh Asa Fitzsimmons III. And a guy ran with the name Jim Hogan. And that guy didn't put a penny into his campaign. He didn't go shake a hand with anyone, and he won. So, my thinking is like names matter, and like having it be digestible matters. Giving someone a marker, something that they can even remember, a mnemonic device, even perhaps. And so, we were like, don't use the full name, which comes from a selfish place as designers. And for her, she wanted to represent her whole family, and it was important to her. And so that's something that she fought for. And good for her. It didn't matter. We did, though, I don't think overthink, but we were like, we got to break this up. Like, we can't put Ocasio-Cortez in that bubble. It just, we tried. It just wasn't going to work. So I kind of qualified, but yeah, something we thought about a lot. Yeah. All right. Y'all have been wonderful. A wonderful, polite Midwest audience. Thank you.